Hi everybody, so lovely to see you all. I was hoping there might be 13 of us, then we'd be a coven, but there's a few more and that's good, you know. I'm just going to talk about witches. I called this Witchcraft Breaking the Curse because I was so inspired by Alexi's fabulous exhibition and their use of sort of various images and symbols that I think are really wonderful. I'm going to talk about gendering the witch in particular. Why are witches mostly kind of like, you know, mostly female, and how did we get to that situation? So I'll just move, here we go, move my slides along a little bit. Okay, now this is very rude, I'm very sorry, I always shock my students. I teach a class for an organization called CAPA, the Global Education Network in London, a lot of undergraduates from the United States. And one of my specialisms is called witchcraft and magical performance. And I just want you to ask yourself this: have you ever said or muttered under your breath at someone and die? Please be honest. Think but don't say who you said it to. Was it recent? Because, you know, we've all been there, we've all done it, right? We've all said this would be a curse, right? Haha. What if the next day you discovered they had indeed died? Do you know what you would be? You would be a witch. Now, the reason I say that is because such an occurrence underpins, for me, one of the most tragic witch cases in British history, and that's the case of the Pendle Witches, which come to trial in 1612. And all that happens, that begins this terrible tragedy that ends with 11 people hanged, is a little girl who's walking down a country path. She's called Alison Devis. She's very poor. She's from a family of women who've mostly been abandoned by their menfolk, and they scratch a living as cunning folk. So by a cunning person, I mean somebody who's kind of like, you know, is your midwife, social worker, confessor, you know, does all those kind of jobs in a community, and probably would never admit to being a witch. But if you had a curse or you felt you'd been hexed, they might help you with that, taking that off. So this little girl called Alison Devis, she's walking down a country path and she meets a peddler, and he's carrying a pack of pins. This couldn't be worse. She asked the peddler to open his pack and give her some pins. And he says, well, something like the curse you've just seen on the previous slide. He tells her where to go. She says something similar, and he then collapses. She says his face went awry. His arm went slack, his legs gave out beneath him. Now, I'm sure out of there, we'd probably think, what was that? Sounds like a stroke. Yeah, he had a stroke. So this altercation has clearly led this man to this peddler to have a stroke. But of course, it happened just after she cursed him, and she was convinced, young Alison was convinced she had witched him. And she helped him to a nearby inn. He started to recover, his family became involved, and in this rather toxic atmosphere where England was in the middle of conversion towards Protestantism, and quite an aggressive form of Protestantism advocated by King James I. This changes things, and so it comes to the point there where you can't find one witch, you've got to find the coven. Now, almost 80 years later, when Britain is starting to find witchcraft a little bit embarrassing in the age of Isaac Newton, across the Atlantic in Salem, Massachusetts, almost 80 years to the day, the same book, which is called Dalton's Country Justice, is being used to examine and try witches. That book has traveled 3,000 miles plus and is being rolled out and used to determine whether or not largely these groups of women are witches or not. So I'm just going to move on quickly with this. If you did that, if you said F off and die, excuse me, you would have practiced maleficium, Latin, mischief, doing harm to others. The Romans had very specific ideas about witchcraft and magic. Generally, I would say, if we look across cultures, witchcraft is what the other lot do. So if you look in something like an ancient text, like say the Old Testament, if you consider what Moses does a bunch of magical stuff. He turns his staff into a serpent and back. He divides the Red Sea. This is all very Gandalfy kind of stuff, isn't it? This is all wizardy stuff, but it's done with God's approval. It's done for the right team. Therefore, it's not witchcraft. Magic and witchcraft are generally what the other lot do. That's not what we do. That's what the other lot do. Do you see what I mean? It's got a real connection to your cultural self, your tribe. If you do these works and call upon your God to protect you, then you're not doing bad stuff. That comes into the Christian tradition. In the book of Acts, St. Peter takes down a magician called Simon Magus. Simon Magus is very impressed by St. Peter's magic, which of course isn't magic because St. Peter is using the Holy Spirit. So Magus asks him if he can buy it. Says, what books have you got? How do I access this powerful stuff? And that becomes the medieval crime of simony, trying to buy the influence of the Holy Spirit, simony. But so if you're doing it in the name of the one true God, whoever your one true God is, it's for the good of your tribe. It's not magic and it's not witchcraft. But as you can see immediately, the control of orthodoxy, of what is magic, when does magic cross over? I think that's quite an interesting one. There's a really beautiful and funny play from the Middle Ages called The Second Shepherd's Play. And it's got a great comedian called Mac, the sheep stealer. And as his name suggests, he steals sheep. And he sets out to steal the sheep of the shepherds who are going to adore the baby Jesus at the Nativity. It's a comedy spoof, carry on nativity kind of play, right? And he casts a spell over the shepherds to make them sleep so he can steal their sheep, but he asks for the help of Jesus to do it. So that's mischief. It's what we might call, you might get an asbo for it. Do you know what I mean? You might get a medieval asbo, but he's asked for Jesus's help. He's not asking for the devil's help. Really, during the Middle Ages, that's kind of the nature of magic. I'm simplifying a bit just for time, but magic is something that can be employed with the aid of righteous figures. You're not asking for satanic or devilish compact. That's going to come a little bit later. I'm going to carry on firstly into a little bit of the ancient world, because the Romans gave us Maleficium, and they were very concerned about witches and magic. So Harry Potter fans, look away now. This is a bad owl. This is a bad owl. So Rome had its witches. Roman literature of the 1st century CE refers to demonic entities in the form of owls called districes. It's interesting, the Italian word for witch is still strega. Strega comes from this demonic owl entity. They attack infants in the cradle, sometimes drinking their blood or abducting them. They appear in the work of the writer Petronius entitled Satyricon. This work also features one of the earliest descriptions of a werewolf. Petronius identifies the districes as female. When injured, they turn into their human form. Their scream was blood-curdling, linking them to the harpies of Greek myth. So in a way, this is one bit of the witch idea, because I think if I gave you 30 seconds to draw a witch, you would, as I would, draw broomstick, pointy hat, woman, cat, broom, classic. That's your witch. This gendering of the witch, I'm just going to try and show you some of these elements. Now, this is one of my most fascinating accounts of the Romans up against a decidedly female power, and they don't know how to cope with it. Now, the Romans, not famous for recording their defeats, they come very close to defeat here as they're attempting to conquer Britain. So in 60 CE, the Romans were trying to subdue the west of Britain, what's now called Wales. They came up against powerful opposition, according to the historian Tacitus in his work Annals of Imperial Rome. So I really like this. On the shore stood the opposing army with its dense array of armed warriors, while between the ranks dashed women in black attire like the Furies, with hair dishevelled, waving brands. All around, the Druids, lifting up their hands to heaven and pouring forth dreadful imprecations, scared our soldiers by the unfamiliar sight. So that, as if their limbs were paralyzed, they stood motionless and exposed to wounds, then urged by their generals' appeals and mutual encouragements not to quail before a troop of frenzied women, they bore the standards onwards, smote down all resistance, and wrapped the foe in the flames of his own brands. So what's clear is the Romans are really scared. And these are seasoned veterans. These aren't the new kids. These aren't recruits. These are seasoned Roman veterans who are very scared by this army of females with various curses and imprecations. It's really frightening to them. It takes kind of, the voice of their commander to bring order to them. So Tacitus was a Roman historian writing decades after the event. However, it's interesting that he chooses to record this event and the fear the ordinary Roman soldiers clearly felt. He seems to be describing a paralyzing fear, but could we also interpret it as a kind of spell casting, a magic cast by females that's only overcome by the voice of their own commander calling out to them in Latin? Generally, the Romans didn't seek to impose religious control over their colonies. They introduced Roman gods alongside native ones. You can see this in images of the goddess Sulis Minerva in the English city of Bath. So what they'll generally do is, they're a polytheistic culture. They have many gods. So they're at their easiest when they're dealing with other polytheistic cultures, because they can go, hey, you know what? We've got a goddess of wisdom. You've got a goddess of wisdom. We'll match them up. We'll kind of like, we'll have a kind of, holiday exchange, and we'll put different ones in, we'll put them in our temple, and you can have one in your temple, and we get, hey presto, Sulis Minerva. So a fusion of goddesses. So a goddess of wisdom, the Celtic goddess of wisdom, and the Roman goddess of wisdom, they kind of pair off. So the Romans often struggle when they're up against monotheism. And very broadly, we might suggest that monotheism might be more likely to persecute the witches. Now, that's questionable. But if you've got a faith that has one set of rules, one God, and one correct way of doing things, you're probably going to be less tolerant of the magical practices of others. It's interesting that the Romans are particularly bloodthirsty in Jerusalem in 70 CE. They don't understand the Jewish God. They don't understand an invisible God, an abstract idea of God. They're very material. They like a God you can hold. You can make a figure of the God and put it around your neck. They like that. They like that. They're materialists, really, in many ways. The abstraction, not so much. Generally, if they're dealing with another polytheistic culture, they can match up gods, and the colonizing is kind of easier for them to do. And of course, the colonized get a bunch of benefits, like they get baths and a theatre and all that kind of stuff. So where does the stereotypical witch come from? In the 4th century, the Roman Empire under Constantine the Great took on Christianity as its faith. The African bishop Augustine of Hippo, one of the founders of church doctrine, in his work City of God, connected the previous pagan gods with the work of the devil. As the Christian faith spread across Europe, pagan, well, I guess I'm slightly simplifying here, but goddesses and gods, pagan festivals have Christian ones placed along or over them, and pagan gods become associated with demonic entities. So you get the Greek Pan. There's a Celtic hunting god called Cernunnos, they both have horns. So they probably give the Christian devil his horn and cloven hooves. Over time, Roman goddesses like Diana were associated with nocturnal activity and flight, so possibly demonic activity. So again, if we go to our broomstick, travels at night is a woman unchaperoned, powerful, and traveling around on her own nocturnally. Yeah, we're starting to get another kind of image, another key aspect of the witch character, the witch image. In the Middle Ages, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the scariest books ever written, which is Amalius, Malifikara and the Hammer of the Witches. In the European Middle Ages, attempts were made to centralize and extend the power of the Roman Catholic Church. This led to the persecution of supposed heretical groups in parts of France, Spain, and Italy via the Inquisition. This provided a mechanism for the later persecution of witches. So in some parts of the world, witches were burned because witchcraft is associated with heresy. Heretics get burned. Their fate is hellish. In England, that doesn't happen so much. It happens a little bit more in continental Europe, and it happens in Scotland, wherever the heresy laws are particularly applied. Witch hunts broke out periodically, but there were more accusations than condemnations and executions. It's an interesting way to read the data, really. An accusation isn't a prosecution, and people back in the day, they know that you need plenty of evidence to persecute somebody for witchcraft. You've got to have plenty of proof. However, a series of famines, floods, and bad harvests in Europe may have accelerated the persecution of witches in some areas. In 1486, Catholic priest Heinrich Kramer published The Hammer of the Witches in Germany. This is a really shocking piece of work. The Hammer of the Witches was a work of paranoia and misogyny. It fused biblical learning with classical reference and, most tellingly, practical insights by the author. What I mean is, we've got the terrible world that we sometimes get online now of experience over study, experience over knowledge. I saw this. So whenever Kramer's kind of confronted by someone saying, well, that's ridiculous, how can you have seen that? He'll go, no, I saw it with my own eyes. I saw a levitation, I saw a demon. And although Kramer is never taken entirely seriously, his descriptions are so vivid, and he combines bits of kind of dubious classical learning with his continual insistence on his experience. You see it later in Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, about 150 years later, who's kind of left on the run in Essex and who wreaks some havoc. Generally, these characters tend to blossom when there's a failure of civil government, and particularly a failure of justice. They tend to step in and briefly have their day. So the female figure he creates is one who's forming a compact with the devil. That's new. That's really new. It gave the would-be witch hunter a selection of evidence to seek out. So things like the mark on the body, the witch's teat. Perhaps the idea of the secretive, malign and angry female witch is born here in the imagination of Heinrich Kramer. It's probably not a coincidence that these accusations are common in areas where the Reformation was taking root and Catholic and Protestants were beginning to demonize each other. So I think that's important. From 1520, I think Martin Luther doesn't just say that the Catholic Church is in error. He says it's evil, it's devilish, it's antichrist. And that's only because the Catholic Church have made so many attempts to kind of abduct Luther and get him to discuss his views in Rome, by which they mean break his fingers and get him to recant. So Luther's demonizing of the opposition, that really, all bets are kind of off from that point on, and both sides begin to see the devilish and demonic in the other, which I don't think would really have been possible before that point. English witches. Okay, England was largely free of major witch hunts until the 17th century. This, as with COVID, you're better off with a woman in charge, in my view. Just saying, everybody. Elizabeth doesn't really tolerate it. There are outbreaks within England during her time, but they're pretty small. And they're mostly around, interestingly, around Essex. There's a very interesting case called the Essex Witches in the 1560s. But generally, Elizabeth isn't having it. She's a very educated woman. And of course, she is in herself a woman in a magical position. Within her image, she's so aware of her image and the manipulation of image. She often appears with her hair down as the Virgin Queen, Artemis. She's fusing images of the classical goddess, the kind of goddess who could be demonized, but through very clever, we might say PR, Elizabeth always remains on the right side of things. Her ability to manipulate her image, and indeed to be aware of it, is, in my view, utterly groundbreaking. When she appears at Tilbury Docks before the Armada in armor, I mean, it's kind of astonishing. She's playing the role of classical goddess, but also Christian monarch defending the Protestant faith. It's an astonishingly brilliant and unstable brew, but boy, does she manage it. She's also an intellectual. You know, I think she spoke 7 languages. She's classically educated. She knows there's nothing in witchcraft. She knows the burden of proof one would have to achieve for these things to be credible. And she knows that an outbreak is dangerous. So I'll just go back to my text. Accusations were isolated and quite rare. In the reign of Elizabeth I, when several outbreaks occurred in Western Europe and in Scotland where witches were burned, 3 witchcraft acts were passed by Parliament, but the burden of proof was high and the accuser had to prove that witchcraft had been used to harm another person. So you'd be accused of the crime. So if you killed someone, you'd be tried for murder. Witchcraft was the implement of murder, but you'd still have to be charged with murder. Elizabeth appeared to have understood the dangers of continental doctrine and resisted it. Sadly, this was not true of her successor, the Scottish King James VI, who became James I of Britain. So she's the Virgin Queen, and by the time of the Armada, that's the brand, right? And I suspect Elizabeth is so bright that there's not really a European prince who can match her intellectually. And so the next available Protestant is James. And James is, I think, a very sad figure in that his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, a Catholic, Elizabeth's cousin, was executed. He's torn from her as a child and raised by very dour Protestants on the other side of the country. He's led to believe very much that the devil is around. And I think it's, you know, he's raised fearful. So James was born in Scotland, son of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, but his mother encountered many problems during her reign, eventually fleeing to England, where she was later executed. James was raised a devout, almost puritanical Protestant by Scottish nobles. From childhood, he was warned about the threat of the devil, and he believed witches were at work in his kingdom. Shortly after his arrival in England, angry Catholics attempted to assassinate him by blowing up Parliament. Remember the 5th of November. Tellingly, in 1597, when he was still in Scotland, James had written a work called Demonology that included many of the ideas of Heinrich Kramer. It was scholarly, easy to read, and very influential on the magistrates in his new kingdom. So the case I opened with, which was Pendle, I don't think that would have happened in the same degree under Elizabeth. Here, people know the king is obsessed with witches. It's why Shakespeare writes Macbeth for him. You know, why not? Why not pander to the king's prejudices and fears? You know, you're trying to win him over to theatre. He's puritanical. Why not show him, you know, wow, here's what we can depict on the stage, all the things that you're worried about, the witches. So demonology, he's already come with that. And if you look in demonology, you can't simply find one witch. You've got to find the coven. So here's sorry, that's the satanic kiss. Someone kissing the devil's backside. Very sorry there. That's a very pleasant woodcut. This is from Demonology by James. For as the servants of God convene for serving of him, so makes he Satan them in great numbers to convene, although publicly they dare not for his service. As none convenes to the adoration and worshipping of God, except they be marked with his seal, the sacrament of baptism, so none serve Satan and convenes to the adoring of him that are not marked with that mark whereof I already spake, the witch's teat. So that's from chapter 3 of Demonology, and it gives you these physical symptoms to look for. Everyone, so, you know, anyone who's got a mark on their body in the wrong context, on the wrong country path, asking the wrong peddler to open his pack for pins, could be hauled before the magistrate. And of course, the magistrates, many of them are upwardly mobile, desperate to please their monarch. The King James Bible, of course, it's the Bible that James commissions that gives us the infamous "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live" in 1611, year before the Pendle witch trials. A New English translation of the Bible gives us Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Now, a witch, again, it's gendered, but it's a mutterer of charms. The idea of what the witch is never really properly nailed down. It's a dangerously vague bunch of habits that are generally the magic that the other lot do, if that makes sense. Now, I always like to show my students this. It's an object found in Greenwich, South London in 2004. What's inside, do you think? You can just see, look, we normally used to find these unstoppered, these bottles. It's called a witch bottle. If you look, that's an X-ray. It was one of the few, it's the only one that had ever been found, I think, with the stopper still in. Whoever made this meant it to work in the same way that anyone making a dangerous explosive device or any other kind of threat means it to work. You can just see what's in here. There's a liquid. It's wee, I'm sorry, it's urine. There are a mixture of pins, curved and straight. Pins again, pins. I mean, yeah, people have been sticking pins in effigies since ancient Mesopotamia. It comes up as a, you know, as a habit there involved in magical practice. It's really is very, very old. In the neck here, you can't quite see, is a tiny leather heart, which is rather beautiful. And yeah, I'll give you the full recipe. X-rays and forensic analysis of the contents show the following: nails, pins, hair, urine, fluff from the navel, so belly button fluff, iron sulfide, sulfur's probably added, a small leather heart. I'll leave this, I'm happy to share the slides later for everybody if you'd like them, so you can click on the links and things like that. But lots of craft. This is witchcraft. If you were caught making this, your defense would be, I don't do magic, this is a counter hex. I'm throwing magic back onto the practicer of Maleficium, the malign witch. So if your cunning folk were found with this and were inspected by the king's men with this, they would say, no, what I'm doing is I'm throwing the spell back on the witch and I'm giving her I'm making it painful for her to wee. That's what this is. It's a spell of pain, a physical hex that's designed to make whoever made a curse to throw it back on them, and so that until they take the curse off, they won't be able to pee without pain. I know, and it's weirdly, it's genuinely witchcraft. There is craft in it. There's great skill. Whoever made this made it to work, and they made it for a specific client round about the time of Macbeth, 1607. Okay, I'll just finish off now. Sorry, I'm worried I'll go over time. I'm just going to wrap up in a second. Justice. Witchcraft is often a way of giving power to the powerless. Particularly, it grants a form of private justice to those who have no access to the mechanisms of public justice. It's a means of getting even. Just to flesh that out a bit, when Henry VIII rips out the Catholic infrastructure of England, so he in the dissolution in the 1530s, he removes monasteries and convents. Well, by doing that, you're removing free healthcare for the poor, and you're also taking away the bank, because anyone who inherits something nice that they can't keep safe at home will leave it with the monks or the nuns and hope they take good care of it. So in a stroke, the Protestant Revolution tears that infrastructure. People fall to use, people want to use instead private versions of these people, cunning folk. And increasingly in the 17th century, we get more and more accusations against the cunning folk, because you want them to find your lost stuff, you want them to heal your pets, you want them to bring your baby's fever down in the night, all the terrifying things that can happen to us. But if they get it wrong, or you don't want to pay them, it's very, very easy to flip that contract and go, you know what, I don't think they are a nice, cunning person after all. So yeah, as a quarrel among the poor, potentially, that's where witchcraft mostly lives. Where's it gone? Social media. What's the modern phenomena of catfishing but love magic? A transformative operation by which a person gets to perform the role of someone else, a way of gaining power by entrapping and entrancing another. Maleficium flourishes where education and civil power fail. It will always attempt to fill a void if we let it. Okay, I think I'm done with those. Oh, shameless plug. Sorry. You can see my play The Instant at Marshfell by Vital Productions at the Stables Theatre, Hastings, Tuesday to Thursday next week. It's about two women who encounter supernatural activity in a house near Rye and meet a decade later to try and work out what happened. It's at the Stables, then it moves to the Space, and that's all the plug I'm going to do. Cool.
Thank you so much, Michael. That's fantastic.
My pleasure, my pleasure. I don't know if there are any questions or thoughts or I can help anybody with or anything like that.
I'm inviting people to put questions in just now, but I think what we'll do is, yeah, address questions to you, Alexi, Adam, whoever, or, you know, ideas. But I think we're going to invite Adam now to share his screen. So don't worry too much, Michael, about you keeping your eye on the chat. I'll have a look at that, and I'll bring those in. So Adam, can we hand over to you? Do you want to share your screen? Make sure that's, yeah.
Yeah.
It's
do you guys have that?
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Michael. I'm so glad I know exactly what to do with my navel fluff now. Yeah, thanks guys. Thanks, Michael, Alexi, and Ashley. I'm going to talk about the tarot, and specifically kind of my it's not really my take, it's an amalgamation of a lot of people's takes, and you'll see that with the tarot, that the tarot is a kind of storehouse of a lot of people's sort of thoughts and philosophies from a particular slant or angle. But for me, and the title of the talk, Tarot, the Art of Transforming the World, is because I view tarot as an art form. And actually, I view it, the experience of having a tarot reading and encountering tarot, I believe actually should be kind of regarded in the same realm as going to the cinema or theatre. And I mean it not just as a divinatory art, but as an experience of a potentially kind of very powerful art experience, which at its core I feel has this key narrative, which is the goal of transforming the self and also the world. Ashley actually gave a little introduction to me anyway. I'll rush through this quick, but my name is Adam Malone. My background's in film and video. When I left university, I got into kind of music performance and later event production, which is what I do today. And from 2012, I've been a tarot reader. I had an interest in tarot before that, but I kind of emerged above ground, you know, as a tarot reader in the shops of kind of Brighton and London from about 2012. And in 2014, I studied an MA in myth, cosmology, and the sacred, and that was really to forward my study of the tarot. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to sort of mention today, and I'm going to really try very hard to condense, was informed by that degree. And then recently, inspired by the tarot, I've moved into immersive storytelling, because actually I feel like the tarot is also a very immersive, immersive narrative structure, actually, and it's got a lot to offer. The kind of dawning of what we're seeing now with a lot of immersive theatre and immersive arts with the new technology that's coming. So yeah, that's me. So the first point that I really want to bring to people's awareness, which you may or may not know, it might be interesting actually if people sort of say in the chat or after whether or not they knew this, that tarot actually existed primarily and historically as a card game that was popular in medieval Europe. So historically, it actually only dates, the earliest evidence of it is the mid 1400s, at which point it was a popular trick-taking card game that was later called trumps in English when it eventually reached England. So that first deck there on the right is the Visconti Forza deck, which is from the 1440s, which is this sort of really elaborate, beautiful deck that was sort of hand painted and commissioned by a royal court. But by the sort of mid 1700s, we've got the Tarot de Marseille, which is much sort of broader, much more common, much more sort of established images at that point. For me, when I realised and found that the tarot was just historic, didn't have this sort of ancient history that had been attributed to it by later occultists, this was kind of a pivotal moment for me. But I really want to, I don't think enough people have really done this, but I really wanted to sort of just mention very briefly about the content of those images. And so the tarot images came out of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance period. And the Middle Ages, obviously, as Michael's talked about, were characterised as like a time of ignorance and superstition, and it's the, you know, the time of a lot of, I mean, it was called the Dark Ages as well, right? So the world of religious authority was kind of placed over personal and experience and obviously rational activity. So it's considered a sort of period of decline from the high culture of the ancient world. And the Renaissance started in the 15th and 16th century to sort of full effect. But these images really are born out of that late medieval stage and early Renaissance. And I think they're quite interesting. So we have stuff like chivalric kind of ideas with the presence of knights and stuff. We've got a female pope, which undoubtedly would have been considered heresy, alongside the content, for example, like the devil as well. It's kind of a more obvious inclusion of images in these decks that is sort of counter to the kind of popular thoughts at the time. We've got the chariot, which is harking back to the Roman period, probably likely the Roman triumph ceremony. And perhaps most interestingly about the tarot deck, the card that we've inherited as the tarot was formerly called the House of God. So we've got an image of the House of God struck by a force from above and falling, and all its inhabitants sort of burning and falling to the ground. The fact that it was called the House of God was a fascinating kind of comment, I think. And so I feel like the tarot was always quite subversive and populist, and in the hands of sort of normal people that probably had, you know, quietly commenting about the power of the church at the time. And then we've got the death card. And interestingly, there's one theory that's been advanced, that is the devastation in Florence that was caused by the Black Death, which hit Europe sort of around the mid 1300s, resulted in a huge shift in the consciousness of people that sort of lots of scholars have speculated that this might have likely caused the Renaissance, because thinkers at the time started to, instead of dwell on their sort of heavenly life or spiritual afterlife, they start to sort of focus on life on Earth. So I kind of found that really interesting to see that, you know, the pandemic may have caused the Renaissance. So I'm kind of hoping for the same. for us in modern times. I also want to sort of focus on this interesting time period, and actually this particular date, which is 1781, which is called a scholar called Maggie Hyde called a symbolic fulcrum. So this is the split where the old world cosmologies and ways of looking at the connected universe and sort of Renaissance ideas sort of gave way really to the Enlightenment. We've got the discovery of Uranus, which previously, up until that point, it was considered there were 6 planets in the solar system, and that the Earth was at its centre, and it was this beautiful kind of pattern of great design that was moving around, and that we were all deeply connected with. The discovery that the telescope kind of blew that out of the water. And you've got Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, which really cements sort of Enlightenment ideas about that we need to be distanced from anything that we observe in order to understand the truth of it. And what I wrote there, underneath there, is that says the concepts of beauty and coherent patterns in nature that the ancient world had kind of observed and found to be evidence of divine activity, were now actually critiqued and considered and suggested that they may actually just be projections. So what we really see is this sort of split from old world ideas and this distance now from the previous connected world. And in that same year, a guy called Anton Court de Gebelin, who, after seeing a group of women playing the tarot, decided and had a sort of symbolic imaginal moment where he decided that the tarot wasn't just a game, but it was in fact of ancient Egypt's origin, that had some sort of mystical Kabbalistic importance. He attributed the papes, the presence of the female pope, he suggested was an image of Isis. He also started to create this mythology around the tarot. He deciphered the word tarot as to mean the royal road, which actually later Egyptologists found to be false. And he also attributed the tarot to the Romany people, saying that they'd moved it out of the ancient Egypt into the West. So none of this has any actual factual, literal evidence, but what it did, and the release of his essay at the same time as all this stuff that was happening in 1781, triggered a whole swathe of essentially further kind of elaboration and philosophical attributions of an esoteric type to the tarot. This guy was the first person to begin talking about the idea of tarot being more than just a card game. And it happened at a really interesting moment. For me, it feels like the old world cosmologies and the old world ideas that were popular during the Renaissance, in order to survive the Enlightenment, emerged and were sort of housed in the tarot cards, kind of by accident, but kind of also in a beautiful way, I think, as well. To the point where we get what we've got today, which is, you know, cards like the Rider-Waite deck in 1909, and the fantastic Crowley-Harris deck in 1944. Both of those guys linked to the Golden Dawn, both of those guys inspired by Eliphas Levi, who was also inspired by the early text that Anton Court de Gebelin wrote. But really what's happening is that this work, I think, is a great work of symbolic and esoteric imagination. It becomes this sort of group art project that spans history, right? And it's efforts to sort of redraw it and recreate it. There's efforts to attribute all sorts of different meanings to it. But behind that is an attempt to sort of recontextualize the world and say that the world is actually a connected and deeply meaningful place. And actually the revelatory way of seeing, which was what Anton Court de Gebelin, who was a sort of Freemason and a clergyman, who experienced at that time when he saw this tarot game taking place, is a sort of sympathetic way of understanding the world, right? And it's a way of interpreting the world as alive and full of symbols. And actually, this sort of attribution and awareness is actually, and an approach to knowledge is deeply feminine in nature, but it was rejected by the Enlightenment. So during the Renaissance period, before this, there was a revival of a lot of this symbolic thinking. And what these symbols represented, they may have literally been proven false by the Enlightenment, but they were images of a connected world that were deeply important to people, that placed us at the center. And actually, that's if we really sort of think about it, it's a wonderful way of really trying to engage in a meaningful environment, is to try and sort of place yourself, and I think we still do to this day, sort of place ourselves at the center of our interactions. But the geocentric vision and the model of the cosmos was definitive for pre-Enlightenment thought, and it places human beings and the planet at the center of the cosmos. As you can see there at the image on the left, the human being here being the microcosm and the macrocosm above it. And there's ideas of an individual soul connected to a divine soul. And we've got this, the reverence for the faculty of imagination, again, rejected by the Enlightenment, for being potentially providing us with false information, as Michael talked about. Like, it's kind of this idea of personal experience sometimes is completely false, and we do need to keep that in check, right? But there's something also very beautiful about it, and the ancient world considered it to be a connection to the divine, and the sense perception of the soul. And a great commentator of this sort of split I'm getting at here is Ian McGilchrist. This book is really dense, but it's fantastic. And there's really cool short video you could watch on YouTube. Maybe I'll put the link in, that explains his ideas. But he really talks about this split in Western thought that emerges and re-emerges. We see it with, we see it in the sort of classical world. We see it then in the Dark Ages, and then we see it with the Renaissance, and then we see it with the Enlightenment, and then we see it with Romanticism, this sort of movement through history of like kind of the two ways in which we're able to view the world. And Ian McGilchrist talks about this as a sort of divided brain metaphor. He says there's left brain and right brain ways of seeing. But really, when it came to the Renaissance, McGilchrist has it really spot on, I think. And I'll read the quote there. It's one of the defining features of the Renaissance must be its opening of the eye to experience, initially almost exclusively personal experience, in preference to what is known to be the case, the teachings of scholastic theory and received opinion, which at the time would have been the medieval, the power of the church influencing the kind of reality of experience for people. There was a faithful imitation of and close attention to the natural world. And actually, yeah, we see that in the Enlightenment, right? A separation from nature, and this the observer is now needs to retain this distance to understand how nature functions. There's an insistence on the interconnectedness of things, and that's a really important point I want to kind of bring here. That the old world cosmology and the way in which tarot functions requires this idea of an connected world. And interconnectedness of things and the importance of the fullest possible context. This also included the body and the soul equally and inseparably as the context of all living things, in the rekindling of empathy in the arts, in the sense of the self as an individual, yet integrated to moral and emotional bonds to society, on inborn and intuitive skills, as well as on the artist as semi-divine being. Now, the reason why that artist was considered to be kind of a semi-divine being, the artist as diviner, and this is where I'm getting at. This is what I'm getting at with tarot as an art form as well, and divination being very much linked to the same principle, is that the model of a connected universe, as exemplified here by Neoplatonism, which is really tough to wrap your head around, and I'll try very hard to, and I can't say that I do understand it, but I'll try to sort of talk to you about it in my limited way here. But the idea of a one world, right? They called it the unus mundus, and there was this assumption that throughout the cosmos was an intelligence that human beings were connected to, right? And it was considered hierarchical, which is a critique of it for sure. But essentially, with that image there on the left, we have the one, the indivisible. Perhaps we would call it God, and Christianity would call it God, creates an image of itself, which is called nous, a perfect image of itself, which is actually the divine mind. And within the divine mind is the world soul, which encompasses and includes all the individual souls that live in the world. And then the next emanation of it is the physical world of the senses. But because they're connected, it's according to Neoplatonism, it's possible that you can live in the sense world and contemplate your way up back through and transcend and realign yourself with the divine principles. And actually, it was considered that artists had an important role in this, that the image of beauty existed at first in the soul of the artist, which then they created and brought into presence in the sense world, and that then we were able to look at their artworks and gain connection to soul, and ultimately the world soul, and then ultimately to the divine. So there's all these ideas that create a kind of deep, meaningful art, essentially, when one lives in the image of a connected cosmology. Yeah, and then what happened post-Enlightenment was that these concepts became psychologized, post-Enlightenment psychologization, which I don't even think that's a word, but what happens is that the externally once connected image becomes internalized, and a lot of the concepts that are kind of weird and wonderful about divination actually become the realm of psychology. So the idea of an inner world emerged during the 18th century, a world that was distinct from the outside world of society and nature. And this suited the Enlightenment separation of man from the cosmos, which had previously sort of been united, as I've said, in a holistic vision of the world. What happened really during the Enlightenment is that we received the machine metaphor of reality, that everything is like a kind of clock, almost like it doesn't have a life of its own. It's just separate bodies all moving around. And actually at that point, the planet, the solar system almost become like meaningless rocks, sort of moving around space. And no wonder that people suffer from a kind of loss of meaning in that cosmology as a result. So the world soul of Plato, which is what I've just talked about there, Neoplatonism, with which man's own soul was entwined, no longer has efficacy, and man's soul was no longer an integral part of the cosmos that became resident solely in the human being. Yeah, and so this is really what I feel like we're dealing with here. And I put those two books on the left, not as a suggestion to read them, but just this idea of like inner planets, right? Before that, the planets were outside of us and had an influence. But that influence might be wrong or right, but it's the idea that the meaning actually then became internalized. And that book there, I don't know what it's about, but it's called Divine Psychology. The fact that the divine now may actually exist within us. And I've put this image of the world card, which is something I've co-created with an artist friend of mine for a tarot deck that I've been working on. But the last card in the tarot, in the major arcana of the tarot, is called the world card. And for me, this idea of a connected vision of the world, of the one world, of the old world, has become this image of a connected self now. That actually what we really must do is, rather than previously connect with the divine, which was out there and through the planets, it's now actually this idea of a connected internal self. Interestingly, surrealism had a sort of fantastic flirtation with esoteric ideas. Andre Breton, who wrote the Surrealist Manifestos, on that first line there, he wrote, "Surrealism aims quite simply at the total recovery of our psychic force by means which is nothing other than a dizzying descent into ourselves." It's really talking about what was felt at that time as a search for meaning, really, and that the route towards meaning was actually this internal seeking. And again, as an artist, it was they saw it as their duty to bring forth these images for society in order to sort of heal themselves, really. And as it says there, Breton viewed the artistic process as comparable to the neurotic process. I think he actually worked in a psychiatric ward during the war, and he'd sort of seen people shell-shocked, victims of shell shock, in which the artist offered differed only from the neurotic by transmuting thwarted desires that appear as pathologies into works of art. In this sense, the artists became attributed with psychic healing properties and alchemical abilities in their capacity to effect a transformation. The surrealists became magicians who sought to effect revolutionary change in the world through art and their own personal transmutation. So the historical kind of re-emergence of the interest in sort of esoteric ideas as it sort of got buried within the tarot, and actually I think Breton had, was it Breton? I think it was Breton who had post World War II. Actually, post World War II, the surrealists really began this full-on occultization of their work, because they saw it as this sort of path to healing. Like the trauma of World War II, they really felt that they really need to connect deeply with themselves. But the historical re-emergence of interest in esoteric ideas and philosophies often accompanies moments of social, cultural, and political upheaval. And really, for me and for the tarot and for anyone that encounters it, it's really this sort of encouraging return to sort of self-knowledge, which was a maxim of the ancient world, right? Written at the temple of Delphi was know thyself, and this is sort of ancient world kind of ideas of connecting with the self. For those guys in a very different way, but for us it seems it's very much internalized, especially when we're sort of living in a post-enlightenment world. Yeah, so surrealism became sort of married really to esotericism post World War II. We've got artists like Andre Breton, Victor Bruno, Max Ernst, Salvador Dali, and the fantastic Leonora Carrington, and Antonin Artaud, who's a theatre director, who Michael might know, all openly engaged with esoteric, magical, and occult philosophies as sources of inspiration. And Nadia Chowcha wrote in her book, surrealism's emergence did not represent a new style or form of culture, but was instead an experimental mode of inquiry and an important re-evaluation of the past that existed as an attempt to explore obscure and neglected aspects of human existence. So for me, really, the obscure and neglected aspects of human existence have flowered at previous points in history, in ancient cultures, particularly, but also really in Europe with the Renaissance, as the Renaissance sort of began to look back at ancient Greece, for example, and really brought forth the texts and their philosophies and ideas. So we may have internalized these things, but they're out there for us to sort of, or they're in there for us to reconnect with. And this really good quote here by Szulakowska, the surrealists became magicians who sought to effect revolutionary change in the world through art and their own personal transmutation. By the early 20th century, this superhuman image of the Renaissance alchemist and magician had been transferred to the artist. And I love this idea of the artist as alchemist, ultimately working to sort of heal themselves and the world. And also there's a lot of similarities with that as a tarot reading as well. I think we do the same. So we've got these two quotes here from Jung, and Jung's actually really important to understand when it comes to attempting to understand how the tarot functions. Jung was a mystic. He was a psychologist, but he was also a mystic. So he's a really great place to go to sort of see these ideas come to life. And he wrote that as scientific understanding has grown, so our world has become dehumanized. Man feels himself isolated in the cosmos because he is no longer in nature and has lost his emotional unconscious identity with natural phenomena. These have slowly lost their symbolic implications. His contact with nature has gone, and with it has gone the profound emotional energy that his symbolic connection supplied. As I've suggested before, this existed in the Renaissance and in ancient cultures and became internalized post-enlightenment. And this quote from Milne, who wrote about divination. Divination is not simply another type of knowledge alongside the objectifying knowledge that reigns in our time, nor is it a type of subjective knowledge as a complement to the objectifying knowledge. These two types of knowledge are really the two sides of the same Enlightenment dualism. Rather, divination belongs to a different manner of orientation towards reality, beyond either the objective or the subjective, in which the initiative of knowing is handed over to the disclosure power of reality itself. In this, it has a close kinship with religious knowledge and artistic inspiration, a receptive veneration for universal being as a whole, in which this veneration is awakened in us by reality itself. That quote, for me, is outstanding in its way of describing what divination does. When you divine, you open yourself up to the idea that the cosmos reality is able to speak to you, and you welcome that message in. So getting towards the end, I've just actually, so this is just sort of trying to tie it up and actually talking about where my work is with this. I've just returned from a conference up in North Yorkshire, at a place called Broughton Hall, which is a fantastic place. That there's a guy called Peter Merry who's just started something called the Weird Experience, which is now going to be a museum of artifacts from some of the earliest scientists to start exploring consciousness and how it interacts with reality, and in particular physical machines. And the hope was that they would be able to prove that we do live in a connected world. And the main tool in which they use to do this is true random number generators. And the concept is that natural phenomena and true random is actually in fact labile, and actually that humans have the capacity to affect the outcome and essentially move things with their mind, which is for these guys evidence to suggest that we do live in a connected universe. That actually the idea of post-enlightenment idea of the subject-object divide was actually false. That there's no such thing as objectivity, everything is subjective. And the guys up at Broughton Hall, they've called this the Weird Experience, which is apparently according to them, and also I think a guy called Brian Bates, who was actually a psychologist, who wrote a book called The Way of Weird, WYRD, and it's an Anglo-Saxon Norse word that talks about the interconnectedness of all things. And where my work, and where actually the tarot sits in that, is that for me, the tarot, when the moment of the shuffle, the idea of synchronicity, as Carl Jung called it, the moment of the shuffle is a truly random moment that somehow has this ability to reflect our minds and our consciousness. It's not accepted science, but it's certainly out there. It's slowly becoming more accepted. And the two guys at the top, Brenda, I forgot her name, Brenda and her partner there, they had the Pear Lab in Princeton University, and they have astounding data to suggest that we do in fact live in a connected world. And so that's really, this is just a shameless plug really at the end there. I was just talking about my virtual reality tarot experience. I've tried to bring the form and function of the tarot into virtual reality, kind of as an experiment really, but to sort of see if you can find meaning in art, in an immersive art context inspired by the tarot. Yeah, and that's it. If you want to contact me, anyone would like to contact me, or I've got a website called thetarotexperience.com, and that's my email address there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much,
No
Adam.
worries.
Amazing. There's so much, in a way, you know, Alexi and I were wondering, like, have we given people enough time to talk about, you know, or space to give you time to talk in depth about all of these really rich ideas? But thank you for condensing so much into the presentation. I've invited questions in chat. People are a little bit quiet at the moment, but Alexi, I know that you have some questions, and you know, if you would like to kick it off, we can start there, and I've invited people to ask more. We've probably got it's going to be quick questions, because we've probably got about maybe 10-15 minutes, I would say, to try to cover some of the inquiries.
Okay, I just want to say thank you so much, both Michael and Adam. I've just been scribbling so many notes throughout that. As Ashley said, you've managed to fit in so much into such a short time. I guess I'll start, because it's more fresh in my mind, just some of the points that Adam was making. I just really love some of the phrases you were saying, like the tarot being this sort of hundreds of year old group art project. And I'm really interested in the different iterations of it in the different decks you can get. And you mentioned is it the Thoth? Am I saying that right? Crowley's deck. I just thought that'd be an interesting point to talk about, because the exhibition Curse Breakers, the curse of the title of the exhibition comes from Crowley's curse, and it's a nice little connection there that Crowley commissioned a tarot deck of his own. So I just wanted to know what's your favorite tarot deck? Do you have the Thoth Tarot?
Yeah, I actually learned with the Thoth Tarot. That was the first deck that I learned with. And for me, that deck is, I'm not a massive Crowley fan, right? I mean, a lot of Western esoteric people, philosophers or writers, whatever, they just I find it very confusing, very in-depth, and too much, a lot of it is too much mind for me, right? So I'm not a particular fan of Crowley's work, apart from his tarot deck. His tarot decks are fantastic. And actually, it wasn't just him, obviously. He had Lady Free Harris, who painted the images. So he commissioned a female painter of the images to do the images. And for me, it's a fantastic kind of crystallization of occult esoteric ideas. And in each card, it has the system of correspondences from the Golden Dawn, which actually he got in trouble for releasing. So he brought that stuff to the public awareness. But yeah, for me, it was a very in-depth, super weird and intense initiation into the tarot to use that deck first. When I went on a trip to Mexico, I spent some time with some shamans in central Mexico, and I had this sort of vision that I should actually change the deck that I used professionally and go back to the Marseille. So now I use the Marseille, and for me, it's much more human. I feel it's much more of this realm. The Crowley deck is this wild esoteric imagination, and it's fantastic for that. And I would recommend people to use that one probably first, because I still, when I pull out a Marseille card, essentially I see the Crowley image there, and all the information around that, because that was really what the tarot was, the divinatory tarot was about, right? It was about collating all this esoteric information and putting it behind the images. So I've just sort of replaced them and gone back to the roots, but really behind it and what makes it work is all of that esoteric philosophy. So it's a really amazing deck, I would say.
Yeah, I've got the classic Rider-Waite one, and I think, as you're saying, the Marseille and the Rider-Waite, having those human core images, I feel helps you learn the meanings more, because you can connect these like core motifs. I really love that diagram of transcendence. Well done for explaining such huge concepts. That was just such a beautiful way of explaining connection.
I may have done it disjustice, to be honest. I mean, it's a very complex system. Like, this Greek philosophy is insane. I'm always I'm very pragmatic about even the tarot, but everything I'm trying to learn, I'm always trying to sort of simmer it down to like the fundamentals and trying to understand it as basic as possible. But yeah, I hope that you sort of understood it.
I've got a little question, actually, Alexi, if you don't mind me interrupting, because it adds to yours. That Katie, who's with us, who is a tarot reader, is asking, Adam, what are your inspirations for the deck that you're designing?
Okay, yeah, so the creator of that deck with me is a guy called Dan Johnson, who's in Lewes. And I came across Dan's work. He does these fantastic collages. And his collages, for me, when I saw them, were just like this snapshot of the unconscious, right? That somehow the unconscious in this sort of Jungian, Freudian and Jungian sense is this storehouse of like random dreams and memories and images and symbols, right? And I love collage for creating that. So for me, collage is a wonderful form for the tarot. And that was really the inspiration. The second inspiration is the Marseille deck primarily. So it's a kind of modern collage, really, of the Marseille, I would say. Yeah, yeah, that's it. I mean, there's lots of images there. We use for the figures. We used Roman and Greek statues a lot of the time. Yeah, for the example, the Fool is blindfolded. I think in the Rider-Waite no, well, anyway, we blindfolded the fool, but we used a VR headset for our one, because even though I work in VR, also I'm aware of the sort of negative implications of VR as a sort of like potential trap, right? So yeah, but there's a sort of a mixture of modern content in those images as well. So.
Thank you. There is another one, but Alexi, I'm going to just give you a little space to ask another question, and then I'll come back to another question from the audience.
Sure, I was really intrigued by this idea of like artist as alchemist that you said at the end of your presentation, and this idea of psychic healing and transmutation of emotion, I guess, or like the inner self into artworks. Because I mean, I'm sure most creators can empathize with that, but definitely for curse breakers, that the exhibition at Delaware at the moment, and just in my practice in general, I can really relate to that idea of translating life experience into symbolic images. And yeah, I just really loved that that idea and the transmutation. That wasn't really a question, sorry.
I'll just add, I just think it really rears its head with the surrealists, right? That in art history, I think it really rears its head there, that, you know, this content of dreams, for example, being the source of inspiration for art. You know, look at Salvador Dali's stuff. It's just incredible, just works of the imagination, but they're reaching deep into their imaginal self and their dreams and occult sort of weirdness in order to sort of like heal themselves, but also again to heal the world. So that, I love the surrealists for that, and I think they were fantastic.
I think there's a, if you don't mind me saying, I think there's a sense in which alchemy is being edited out of history a little bit, and it's recently been recovered, because I think the respectability of Isaac Newton is and the reputation of Isaac is something that's really been recently rediscovered, and that you know, that we put him on banknotes and stuff, and he's the poster boy for a modern idea of science. But all the gravity stuff is done in his 20s. The rest of his life is spent working in alchemy, is in the classic alchemia. You know, he's just trying to discover the secrets deep within the universe, which, Adam, I think so beautifully was in what you were saying, was that idea that that could be now, might be viewed as quantum, as the reciprocal nature of certain kind of like moving subatomic particles. You know, as soon as we split something, more stuff falls out. I sound a bit like Phoebe in Friends. I'm sorry. a description of Ross's science. But I mean, that's the real Newton. The real Newton is obsessed with those questions of transmutation. But when his works were bought by the economist John Maynard Keynes kind of, I'm a big fan of Keynes, but he edited those elements out to give us a respectable scientific poster boy. But within the very champion and poster boy of post-Renaissance science, alchemy is writ large.
Yeah, and that also happened. That also happened with Carl Jung, right? That when Carl Jung passed away, I don't know if it's called the Carl Jung Society or whatever they're called, that protect his estate and his works. They didn't release the Red Book for a number of years, and the Red Book was his fantastic drawings. They almost looked like tarot cards, but he had basically a psychotic breakdown where he went into the images of the unconscious, and images of the unconscious came to him, and he expressed them in these fantastic pieces of art. But they held on to them for years, because they were like, oh shit, this is going to besmirch his name as a sort of rational kind of scientist of the psyche. So yeah, it happens, right, that there's a lot of weird experiences in life, and we brush them aside because culturally we were told to. Post-Enlightenment, with the object and the subject, we need to observe these things from a distance to understand them, but actually they happen all the time. And so that's probably what the surrealists were doing, right? They went, there's a lot of weird stuff that happens in life, and I'm going to allow it and let that inform my who I am.
Fantastic. May I ask a question of Michael, just a little bit? Because obviously you give us this great historical, well, I know it was a moment, let's say, in history, in the period, but I wanted to ask you just about Wicca, and you kind of touched on its relationship, you touched on modern witchcraft and its relationship with social media. And I, as I said to you at the beginning, I'm not any kind of expert through Alexi's show. I've been trying to learn some things. And I thought like Wicca was maybe quite ancient. And then I looked up and found it's a very, very modern, or relatively modern religion, I guess it might be called, or I don't know if there's another way of describing it. Is it a religion, or people who are involved in Wicca? Is that an area you know about?
It's not an area I know a huge amount about. I admire it hugely. I think it is a constructed faith, but in a way it needs to be. I find there's an interesting analogue between the rise of spiritualism, which is one of my kind of specialisms, in the 1850s, 1860s. Spiritualism gives women agency in a way they wouldn't normally have it, in the sense that the idea of femininity as somehow fragile and frail, and all that stuff the Victorians keep throwing, suddenly becomes flipped, and they become the more sensitive channels for higher levels of information. So you've got a bizarre sight, I think in Harley Street in about 1863, there's a woman called Emma Hardinge Britton, who's who has men flocking to listen to her, to attend her salon, where she channels people like Kant, who Adam's mentioned. She channels various German philosophers. And it's a way of ventriloquizing. It's a way of being heard and spoken and listened to, which I think is really remarkable. And I think, in a way, Wicca, it's unashamedly and beautifully female. It asserts the female principle in a way that's just much needed. And in that respect, the way in which kind of the two constructed religions of the last 150 years would probably be spiritualism, created by two teenage girls in New York State in 1848, and Wicca, created kind of between and post-war. Both are designed, I think, rather brilliantly to give agency to those who lack it, and whose agency, frankly, we seriously need.
Thank you.
Just touching on the social media aspect of things, when you're talking about Kramer, the German guy who was very was demonizing women in terms of witchcraft, it did, and talking about his own experience, it did really remind me of sort of online rhetoric at the moment that you can find in corners of the internet that is very anti-women, sort of I don't know if you know about incel culture, and you know, parts of the alt-right, and their view on women and society is from their own experiences of not their own very sheltered life experiences, I guess, of not their lives not working out in the way they want it to, and therefore demonizing women, a whole gender. And it really sort of reminds me of that, because we've got social media versions of witchcraft, modern, and also the sort of social media versions of witch hunters.
That's your profile of a witch finder right there. I mean, because there's a great Hammer movie, I think it's Hammer, called Witchfinder General, where Vincent Price plays Matthew Hopkins, and he was like in his 60s. But the scary thing about Hopkins is he was young. He was in his 20s. And often these charismatic young individuals, really with an axe to grind, who are charismatic, who get to create a narrative. It's usually not very long-lived, but it's powerful if there's a lack of justice and there's a failure of civil power. Across the world, that's where you always see brutal outbreaks of witch hunting, where there's a collapse in civil power, in scholarship, in the ideas of discourse and sharing things, and the idea of individual pain becomes emotionally what people go with. We see it a lot online. We see it a lot in the whole Trump business, those people who attack the Capitol. I mean, it's nonsense, but they repeat it so many times. It has almost an incantationary quality. It becomes truth. And no matter what reason you throw, and that's the scariest thing of all, they will always say, no, I just don't believe you. And in a way, it's just, I think that's a storm that just has to be ridden out. It never lasts long. It's emotionally driven and it's painful. But I think in a way, social media is the new magic, and we need to learn to use it sensibly.
Yeah, I think someone's just said in the chat, I'd find it interesting to hear people's views on witchcraft as a modern aesthetic trend. This is something I see quite a lot on the internet at the moment. So I'm wondering what your thoughts were on both use witchcraft on social media and tarot on social media.
Yeah, tarot's like majorly popular on TikTok at the moment, right? So, I mean, I like to see it because for me, I feel like people would complain about emojis and how language is getting reduced. But for me, I actually quite like the idea that, or the concept that young people are now communicating with symbols and images, right? And I kind of like that idea. I feel like there's a generational shift. It might well be a generational thing that tarot is now the things that, that were considered weird 40 years ago are now going to be kind of considered normal amongst the next generation. But yeah, so I feel like it's a generational thing. I feel like it's also this, what I mentioned before, this pursuit and this search for meaning in a kind of like rational secular society. I think these things crop up again, right? And yeah, I'm not sure really about witchcraft. I don't have a strong opinion, or I'm really open to sort of hear more and more about it. Yeah, I guess there may still be a sort of a pervasive prejudice, right? And I'm sure there is, that I think it falls under right wing, and it may actually fall under the divide that I've spoke about before already, and that Ian McGilchrist talks about, that there's a divide. There's two ways. There's always two ways of looking at things, right? And we see it a lot in cultural sort of chat on social media, and we really saw it a lot post-Trump. There's always two ways of looking at something. And I have to remind myself that as well. And I think it's healthy if we do all remind ourselves that you may jump one side or the other, and you may flip-flop between perceptions. But yeah, I guess that the witch hunt may be something around that nowadays. Like that would be my sort of immediate thoughts on it. Yeah.
Michael, I don't know if you want to say anything more about, I mean, you have spoken a little bit about, witchcraft as a modern aesthetic trend. This was a question from Katie.
Yes, that's so interesting. I guess I tend to think of witchcraft as a social media and witchcraft as kind of metaphorically speaking to each other, in that witchcraft is generally a female practice. In the Renaissance, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, it's a way of gaining agency for those who don't. It's a way of attempting to get even for those who don't have access to justice and the mechanisms of justice. So I think that's true of social media. I think people attempt to inflict their pain on others through social media, to make their point through social media, which I think is rather frightening and uncontrolled, and like magic itself can have all kinds of strange effects. I do think catfishing in particular is very much like love magic, in the fact that you can create a personality to distract another person, to enact a fascination, to make somebody look elsewhere while you do something else. I mean, that's incredibly magical activity. So I guess if I had to think of something that people have access to, as an analogy to witchcraft, I would say it would be the control of social media, the manipulation of imagery within social media, the creation essentially of other people. I mean, there's nothing more magical than that.